Hello dear friends, today we have June 16, Monday. Let's start with Washington Post. There was published an article by a scientific worker of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is located in Washington, is one of the largest analytical centers in the world. It was founded in 1962. This center conducted a deep study of the losses of Russian troops on the territory of Ukraine and made very serious strategic conclusions. On the basis of this, the employee of this center, Raleigh McCabe, published a brief content of this study in the opinion column, which I will give to your attention first of all. The headline of this article is "Russia Declares Its Victory."
Данные говорят об обратном. Здесь вспоминается, что на прошлой неделе Украина произвела
Data speak of the opposite. It is mentioned here that last week Ukraine conducted a raid against peaceful, so to speak, bombers in the Russian Federation, capable of carrying nuclear weapons, the operation that shook the whole world. And in connection with this, the author writes, the attack, which was planned for many months and was started in the territory of Russia, demonstrated what limited means can be used to achieve significant results. Russia, on the contrary, has spent the last 17 months trying to advance in Ukraine with the help of stupid, rude force. And according to the new data that they have developed, these efforts have not brought significant results to Russia. Several maps are published here, but I will not bother you with these maps. I will only say in general what they show. On the map, the first shown territory of Ukraine is occupied by Russia in January 1924. And since then, since January 1924, it has been 17 months since the last analysis of events in this study was carried out. And over these 17 months, Russian troops have occupied less than 1% of the territory of Ukraine. The area is less than the state of Delaware, such a small state, the territory of the United States, so that the people are more understandable. Russian troops were advancing on average only 50 meters a day during the offensive in the Kupiansk region, and approximately 135 meters a day in some areas of the Donetsk region. Where Russia achieved the greatest successes were in January 1924. These efforts brought less than 1,800 square miles in kilometers. It will be 4,652 square kilometers. The new territory, captured from January 1924, decidedly does not meet the goals of Moscow to significantly expand control over the Ukrainian territory. The offensive of the Russian troops in some areas was slower than the offensive of the Allied troops during the devastating offensive of the First World War on Somme, a battle that became a synonym of expensive and, attention, useless military operations. The author compares not only the collective of authors but also the fact that the orcs, their military feats from January 1924 on the territory of Ukraine, with useless and expensive military operations that exist in the history of mankind. The number of Russian dead in Ukraine currently exceeds the total number of Soviet and Russian soldiers who died in all the wars in which the Soviet Union took part since the Second World War. By the summer of this year, the total loss of Russian soldiers will probably exceed 1 million people. Well, as far as I understand, they have already exceeded. Russia also constantly loses 2.5 times more combat vehicles on the battlefield than Ukraine, including, again, in January 1924, about 1,200 armored vehicles, 3,200 infantry vehicles, and 1,900 tanks. This is a harsh reality which refutes the claim that Russia dictates the conditions of the conflict. Yes, Russian troops are on the offensive since the beginning of 1924, with some exceptions. However, the initiative, a very important thought, it should be remembered. The initiative itself is not a victory. What is important is not only what Russia has received, but also what it has lost in return.
взамен.
Russian troops are still facing a well-established front line, consisting of changing fields, trenches, anti-tank barriers, and so on,
противотанковых заграждений и так далее,
which were created by Ukraine and which are being torn apart on the part of the Russian armed forces of the Russian Federation.
атаки вооруженных сил Российской Федерации.
The strategy of deep defense of Ukraine, supported by the US and Europe, turned the battlefield into a war of exhaustion, which is favorable for defenders and punishes attackers.
И наказывает нападающих.
You need to remember, think about this idea in general. That is, it is all in the past. From all the rumors that are connected with the Kremlin with Russian propaganda, it is only heard that Russia is on the way to a grand victory. Therefore, why the negotiations? And it is coming. And Putin is sure that there will be an inevitable victory. That is, a big country, many people. For exhaustion, it must win the war. No, it turns out that 17 months after the beginning of the Russian offensive is taking place. And on the battlefield of the Ukrainian war on exhaustion, it is favorable for Ukraine in relation to the losses that took place. The Kremlin is unable to move forward more than slowly. Indeed, the Kremlin's path to victory lies not through brilliant victories on the battlefield, but through the possible refusal of the United States from the support of Ukraine. That is, it sounds like a sentence for Russia.
Для Раши. Вот в этой фразе все, что она стоит. За всем этим мишурным блеском парадов, всяких дней там России и так далее, за всеми этими пропагандистскими шумами по поводу величия России,
countries that in their territory are much larger than Ukraine, much larger population, a lot of resources that allow to replenish this military treasury, Putin's military chest. And yet this country, this Turkestan, is not capable of victory over Ukraine, and it has only one hope, that the United States, in the face of Trump, will stop helping Ukraine. The only chance, no battlefield, no great victories, and so on. Betrayal, betrayal in Washington. This is what Russia can count on. This is despite the fact that it is protected by North Korea. And North Korea turned out to be the only force that allowed Russia to free its own land, the Kursk region. Russia was unable to do this. It needed Kim Jong-un's land snakes to do this work. Despite drones and ballistic missiles from Iran, Russia was unable to do this. Putin makes the following text. Putin makes a bet that the political fatigue in Washington gives him what the army cannot give him. This bet is also spread over the negotiating process. Despite limited success and growing losses, Moscow does not show any particular interest, or pretend that it does not show any particular interest, to serious diplomacy, insisting on maximalist conditions and making new strikes. However, a much weaker position is hiding behind the loud statements than many in the West. This is a very good report. It should have been published in the appropriate structure in Ukraine, which is primarily connected with information and politics. It should have been received in this center and distributed in the West. A lot of work has been done by useful people. American politicians must assess the possibility of expanding the acceleration of military aid in Ukraine. This is the conclusion of this study. The United States must also increase economic costs for the continuation of the war in Ukraine. It is remembered that Congress is now considering a two-party bill by Graham Blumenthal. One of the analyses shows that secondary sanctions that are contained there can reduce Russia's income from oil sales by 20%. At the same time, prices for gasoline in the United States have grown by only 15 cents per gallon. This is nothing at all. If you look at our prices here, it's about 52 cents. Russia does not attack. It loses people and equipment to conquer only a few meters of territory, and this will lead to victory only if Washington allows it. But what kind of sovereignty is here? The Kursk territory is liberated by the North Korea, a half-mad country which was far behind at the beginning of the 19th century. And here, in Ukraine, the fate of Russia depends on whether or not Washington allows it. Well, if we add here the Kabbalist dependence on oil, then what kind of sovereignty are we talking about here? It's just Orkistan. Well, what I wanted to say at the beginning, so to speak, is an overture to today's issue. This morning, an article appeared. The information network got information that more than 30 Ks-135 and Ks-46 aircraft took off from the territory of the United States and flew across the Atlantic. Well, I saw the pictures of these radars, and the analysts claimed that the speech, judging by these pictures, was that they were heading somewhere in the north of Europe. Maybe, let's say, they gave an example, first of all, in Finland. And also by the height of the flights, how they flew, they assumed that this was not connected with the transportation of some kind of cargo, gasoline, kerosene, or something else, and this is redistribution. And the analysts, they guessed it was really redistribution, and a large-scale one. Large-scale, which allowed to restore the strategic bridge that existed between the United States and Western Europe during the Cold War, and according to which the mass transfer, the Reforger movement, which worked out how this bridge would work if the Soviet Union attacked Western Europe. Now it turns out that these planes were heading to Ramstein, Germany, Great Britain, Estonia, Greece, and other bases in Northern Europe and the Eastern NATO flank. Experts noted that it was likely a strategic relocation to provide a long-term possibility of refueling NATO and the United States, which will operate in Europe and in the Middle East, because despite the fact that they analyzed the flight map or direction at the very beginning, the analysts assumed that they would fly to Northern Europe. Many immediately assumed that these flights were connected with the war between Israel and Iraq and represent a dramatically new phase, which has already provided almost direct interference of the United States in this war. Well, I looked, collected the information, analyzed what it means to relocate in the context of the war between Israel and Iran. It turned out the following. From the point of view of logistics, the NATO base in Northern Europe and on the eastern flank The point is that this allows you to maintain test readiness for combat actions. If necessary, quickly transfer planes to the Middle Eastern theater. That is, this is a preparatory step. This is not the beginning of an active interference in the Middle East war. For this, you still need the planes themselves, which will strike. But this is very serious. This is a serious and massive step. This is a demonstration of readiness. The United States makes it clear that if Iran crosses a red line while it is being tolerated, they will act. This is the signal. This is a dramatic change in the initial position of the United States, which at the first hour after Israel began to strike on Iran, the State Department announced in its statement, which was signed by Rubio, that we have no relation to this conflict and our only concern is the safety of our citizens in this and other regions. Then it was all changed in the most radical way by Donald Trump. But what was it based on? Not on strategic analysis, not on any analysis of the geostrategic situation and the national interests of the United States.
ситуации и национальных интересов Соединенных Штатов.
It was
Это было
analyzed by Donald
проанализировано
Trump,
Дональдом
probably in the
Трампом,
night hours,
наверное, там
insomnia. I
в
was impressed by all of
ночные
this in one of his
часы,
posts, where he
бессонница.
was once again
Это
torn
все
apart.
отразилось в одном из его постов, где его очередной раз прорвало.
Well, then I'll tell you about it
Ну, об этом
later. What does it
поразбавим я
mean?
вам в этом
Well,
разделе.
okay, from the point
Что
of view of the
означает,
Middle
ну ладно,
East
вот с точки
conflict,
зрения
it is clear that the
ближневосточного
United
конфликта, тут
States has
понятно,
now
Соединенные
changed its
Штаты
attitude.
поменяли теперь свои отношения.
This
Это
is a
сигнал
signal to
Ирану.
Iran: stop, finish your military
Прекращайте,
actions, otherwise it will be bad.
заканчивайте
The
свои
Americans
военные
changed their
действия, иначе будет
minds. What
плохо.
does it mean from the point of view of
Американцы
Europe?
передумали. Что это значит с точки зрения Европы?
Well, first of all, this
Ну,
is very
во-первых,
important
это
from the
очень
point of
важно
view of
с
Europe
точки
and
зрения
Ukraine,
Европы
I
и
would say,
Украины, скажем,
because the
потому что
Kremlin and Russia are hopeful that the
Кремль,
Americans will
Раша, она
leave Europe.
упивает надеждами, что все-таки американцы уходят из Европы,
And then it will be easier
и
for
тогда
Russia to
Раша
deal
будет
with this
легче
very Europe. Analysts estimate this
справиться с этой самой
predislocation as a
Европой.
confirmation of
Аналитики
America's
оценивают
strategic
эту
adherence to
предислокацию как
Europe.
подтверждение стратегической приверженности Америки Европе.
The planes were transferred to Ramstein,
Самолеты
Estonia,
были
Great Britain, and
переброшены в
Greece.
Рамштайн, Эстонию,
These are the
Великобританию,
points of
Грецию.
logistical and
Это
operational
точки
control in the zone of
логистического и
responsibility of our
оперативного
NATO.
контроля в зоне ответственности НАТО.
In fact, the
Фактически
logistical
восстановлена
chain of
логистическая
times of the
цепочка
Reforger and
времен
Atlantic
операции,
Reserve
о чем я вам
operations
говорил,
has been restored.
Reforger и Atlantic Reserve,
It was
которые были
restored not
свергнуты в
because it was
22-м,
restored by
23-м
Trump
годах,
or his
которые восстановлены.
administration, but because it was
Восстановлены не
restored
потому, что
by
ее
this
восстановил Трамп
so-called
или эта
deep state,
администрация.
which
Ее
I have already
восстановило
talked
вот
about.
это так называемое глубинное государство, о котором я уже
These are
рассказывал.
the
Эти люди
people who are
называются
holding on to
дефициты.
everything
И все
now.
эти сверху
Those on top are the defense
министры
ministers,
обороны,
Trump, who are breaking the
Трамп,
water, and the
баллонеты в
colonels,
воду,
captains,
а
mayors are sitting in the
полковники,
headquarters and
капитаны, майоры сидят в штабах и
developing those plans which, from the
разрабатывают те
point of
планы,
view
которые
of
с
the
точки
NATO
зрения
strategy of
стратегии
the
НАТО,
United States
Соединенных
make
Штатов
sense to carry
имеет
out.
смысл проводить.
So this maneuver or
Так
relocation
вот,
is an answer to
этот
speculations
маневр
that the United
или
States is turning
передислоцирование –
its
это
operations
ответ
in Europe and
на
its interests in Europe.
спекуляциях о том, что Соединенные Штаты сворачивают свои операции в Европе и свой интерес в Европе.
The presence of the military presence, the strengthening of
Военное
the
присутствие, усиление военного присутствия Соединенных Штатов в этом регионе становится инструментом демонстрации
military presence
твердой
of the
руки
United States in this region is becoming an
вместо
instrument
ухода
of the
Соединенных Штатов
demonstration of the firm hand, instead
изоляционизма
of leaving.
появляется вдруг откуда ни возьмись призрак, как знаете, из земли, из могилы твердой руки
The
Трампа.
United States of complete
Это
isolationism, a ghost
страховка для
appears out of
европейских союзников,
nowhere, as you know, from the
государств,
ground, from the grave of the
таких
firm.
как Польша,
And of Trump.
Португал,
This
государства
is
Балтии,
insurance for
Финляндия,
European allies, for
которые
countries
выражали
such as
тревогу по
Poland, the
ослаблению
Baltic states,
позиции
Finland, which
США.
expressed
И,
anxiety
наконец,
about
это
the weakening of the
контруправление на
US
Кремль,
positions.
который видит,
And finally, this is
что
a counterpressure
на
on
фоне
the Kremlin,
ударов по
which sees that
стратегическим
against the
объектам
background of
и
strikes on
ядерным
strategic
объектам
objects and
или базам дислоцирования
nuclear, or
или
as a base of
дислокации
dislocation of strategic bombers in
стратегических
Russia against the background of
бомбардировщиков
these
России
radical
на
events, the
фоне
United
этих
States does not go out. They,
радикальных
on the
событий
contrary,
Соединенные
return
Штаты
to
не
the region.
выходят, они наоборот возвращаются в регион.
This undermines
Что
the
подрывает
thesis
эти
of
слухи
Moscow,
о
its
расколе
propagandist
Еврокомиссии, о расколе
Orizkalia in the
НАТО
Orizkalia
и
of
дает
NATO, and gives Ukraine
Украине
additional
дополнительные
diplomatic and other
дипломатические и
opportunities.
другие возможности.
These are peaceful
Это
aircraft
есть
and
мирные
refuelers, which, if
самолеты
necessary, will
дозаправщики,
refuel peaceful
которые в
NATO
случае
fighters and
необходимости
bombers, if
дозаправят
they are needed in the
мирные натовские истребители и бомбардировщики, ежели
Middle
они
East and in the
понадобятся на
zone of
Ближнем Востоке
responsibility of
и
the
в зоне
eastern NATO flank,
ответственности
which is of special interest to
восточного
us.
фланга НАТО, который для нас с вами представляет особый интерес.
Well, now let's move on to the
Ну, а теперь
analysis of the
перейдем
results of the 4
к
days
анализу
of war
итогов
between
4-дневной
Israel and
войны
Iran,
Израиля и
which
Ирана,
I don't know how,
которая,
after all, the
не знаю,
world, but
как
many analysts,
весь мир,
including in the
но
United
многих
States and
аналитиков, в том числе и в Соединенных Штатах и в Европе,
in
она
Europe, they
действительно
really
действительно.
surprised. Israel got into a problem.
Израиль попал
The
в проблему.
beginning or the outline
Начало и
of this
контур
problem I
или мёртв этой
explained to you
проблемы
in the
я вам
first
изложил
video
еще
about.
в первом же видео о начале этой войны.
The beginning of this
Когда
war,
я
when I paid
обратил
attention to the
внимание
need, that
на
is, if you
необходимость,
already
если
start
ты
such a
начинаешь
war on
такую
this
войну
matter,
по
then you
такому
need to
поводу, то
100%
нужно 100%
destroy these
уничтожать
reactors,
эти
this
реакторы,
nuclear program
эту
completely,
ядерную программу
otherwise there is a
полностью,
great danger.
иначе возникает большая опасность. Ну и
And somewhere
в
Israel got
результате
into
Израиль
this
попал
problem, faced
в
this
эту
danger, it became
проблему,
clear as a result of
столкнулся с
4
этой
days of
опасностью, и
war.
это стало понятно по результатам 4 дней войны.
But thank God,
Но, слава богу,
apparently the
видимо, был у
Israelites had
израильтян
plan
план
B,
«Б»,
like every
как у
smart
каждого умного
person, and they were
человека.
ready for it.
И они оказались к этому готовы.
Therefore,
Поэтому
at
с
the
самого
very
начала
beginning, they
действовали
acted not
некоторые
only in one
подготовленные
direction,
группы.
it is necessary to
Там 100%
100%
были
destroy these
уничтожить
reactors, all of
эти
them,
реакторы,
I
все,
emphasize.
подчеркиваю.
But they
Но
looked
они
at the problem wider. They began to
посмотрели на
destroy
проблему
people,
шире.
the living force,
Они
who were
начали
associated with this
уничтожать
nuclear program.
людей, живую силу, которые были связаны с этой ядерной программой.
Assuming that if it is
Предполагается, что
not
если не
possible to
удастся на 100%
100% destroy
уничтожить
the
реактор,
reactors, and
то
first of
прежде
all,
всего,
in the main
главным
way, it is
образом,
Fordow, then the total
Fordow,
damage to
то совокупность поврежденных
some degree
в
of the
той или иной
reactors
степени
and other
реакторов,
nuclear
других
objects,
объектов
their programs, with the
ядерной
number and
их
importance of the
программы,
liquidated military
с
leaders.
количеством и важностью ликвидированных
Physicists,
военачальников,
nuclear experts, all this
ядерщиков,
togetherness
все
will
это
allow
в
to solve the
совокупности
problem,
позволило
that is, to
решить
deprive
проблему,
Iran of the ability to
то есть
produce nuclear
лишить
power.
Ирана возможности
What happened to
производства
us with these
ядерного
reactors,
оружия.
in short, is the state of
Что
the
у нас
present
произошло
day.
с этими
In general, on a
реакторами в
large
будущем?
scale, we must say this is what is
Вот состояние на
interesting, what
настоящий
attracted
день.
my
Вообще, по
attention.
большому счету, должен сказать вот что интересно, что привлекло мое внимание.
As far as I understand,
Насколько
as
я
American
понимаю, как
analysts
из
right
изучения
here, in
сказал,
Israel, the message that
в
the enemy
Израиле
hit the territory of
сообщение о том,
Israel is
что
made only by the
противник
corresponding state
поразил на
structure.
территории Израиля, делает только соответствующая государственная
This
структура.
is not done by local
Этим не
analysts,
занимаются
local bloggers, and
мириады
so on.
местных
And this is
аналитиков
absolutely right because it
и
is clear to the
местных блогеров
military.
и так далее. И это совершенно правильно, потому что, понятно, военному
Leadership
руководству
in
вообще-то
general
все
to all the
боятся
military
рассказ о
that
том,
the
что
story that they
удалось
managed to hit
поразить
Iran gives the
Ирану, это
enemy
дает
the
противнику
opportunity to
возможность
improve the quality of their
улучшить
strikes.
качество своих ударов.
This is where the
Отсюда
fog of
появляется
war
туман
appears,
войны,
that some
потому что
time
проходит
passes
какое-то
between when
время
the object is hit
между
and when we
тем,
find out
когда
how it was hit.
объект поражен, и тем, когда мы узнаем о том, что, как он поражен. Поэтому все
Therefore,
это,
all this
опять-таки,
again means the
имейте в виду,
presence of a fog of war to
присутствует
a
в той или
certain
иной
extent,
степени
but I still
тумана войны,
relied on
но
those
я
analysts
все-таки
who,
опирался на
as
те
I
аналитиков,
believe, have
которые
more
считали
objective full knowledge
необладаемыми
at the
какими-то
present
такими
moment.
полными знаниями на настоящий момент.
So at the
Так
moment,
вот,
4 of the most
на
important
настоящий
nuclear
момент
centers are affected,
поражены
3 to some extent.
из 4 важнейших ядерных центров поражены в той или иной степени 3.
Moreover, some of them are
Некоторые
not
из них
so
не так
critical.
уж и
Let's say one of
критические.
them
Ну,
is
допустим,
affected.
один
It
там
is precisely
точно
established that an electric
установлено,
power
что там
plant is
поражена
affected there.
электростанция. На
The
основании
basis for
этого
this is assumed
предполагается,
that in this
в этом
object, where
объекте,
there
где
is a
глубоко под землей
centrifuge deep
находятся
underground
центрифуги,
which produces uranium
которые
enrichment,
производят обогащение урана,
the centrifuge
а
rotates at a
центрифуги
crazy speed,
вращаются
and if a
с
blow is made to
сумасшедшей
the
скоростью.
station
И
turns
если
off, the light
наносится
immediately
удар по
turns
станции,
off.
станция вырубается, свет моментально выключается. Это
This is
тогда
if there are
единый
no
там нет
additional generators,
дополнительных
and if there are
генераторов.
none,
А
no
если у
one
них
knows
нет,
except those who
никому
work there,
неизвестно,
you
кроме
will
тех,
not
которые
ask them.
работают, у них не спросишь. Так
So
вот,
here,
если,
if, as
как
analysts
думают
think, there is
аналитики,
such a sharp
происходит такое
shutdown of
резкое вырубание
electricity, then a significant part of centrifugal force can
электричества,
simply come
то
into an unfavorable
значительная
state, and
часть
that's how it
центрифуг могут
analyzes.
просто прийти в состояние негодности. Вот так анализируют.
In short,
Короче
now we have
говоря, вот
analyzed
сейчас
3 centers
проанализировали
where
3
various degrees of work with this
центра,
uranium and its
там,
preparation
где
for
происходят
enrichment
различные
end.
степени работы с этим ураном и его подготовку к
Enrichment process
обогащению,
are taking
процесс
place. I'm not a
обогащения.
physicist,
Я
I'm a
не физик, я
nuclear
ядерщик.
engineer.
Я
I'm
уверен на
200% sure
200%,
that
что
now
сейчас у
we
нас
will have
окажется
several dozen
соблюдатели,
academics in this
несколько
area,
десятков
and perhaps
академиков в этой
even
области. И, возможно, даже те, кто
those
в
who
свое
worked
время
on the
работали
Manhattan
над
Project in
Манхэттенским
their
проектом.
time. Therefore, I
Поэтому
apologize in
заранее
advance if I
прошу
use the wrong
извинения, если я
terminology.
использую неверную терминологию.
So, by hitting 3
Так вот,
centers, the
значит,
chain through which the process of
путем
working with
ударов
this
по 3
uranium or enrichment
центрам
passes, it was
цепочка,
interrupted.
по которой проходит процесс работы с этим ураном, его обогащения, она прервалась.
That is, there is no
То
longer
есть
this
нет
constant
уже вот
process
этого
that allows us to
постоянного
continue receiving this
процесса,
enriched uranium.
который позволяет продолжать получение вот этого обогащенного урана.
How much time is needed to
Сколько времени
restore? It
нужно
depends on
для
how much this
восстановления?
station was
Это
destroyed.
зависит
That
от
is, the
того,
station was largely
до
destroyed.
какой
This is
степени была разрушена эта
100%.
станция. То есть установлено, по большому счету, что была разрушена станция. Это вот 100%.
And how
А
much
сколько
time will it
времени
take for the
иранцам
uranium
понадобится,
to be
чтобы ее
restored?
восстановить,
No
никто не
one
знает.
knows. Some say
Некоторые
maybe a
говорят,
few
несколько
months,
месяцев,
some say
некоторые
maybe a
говорят,
few
может,
weeks.
несколько недель.
Well, that's how
Но
you
так,
can
по
imagine
большому
the
счету,
station.
Путин
But
очень
this is not a
станция,
spaceship.
это же не космический
Maybe in a
корабль,
few
может быть,
days,
за
probably.
несколько дней. Наверное.
Therefore, this
Поэтому
is the analysis
вот
of
такой
analysts
анализ
now. But most
у
importantly,
аналитика сейчас.
gentlemen, this is our
Но
Fordow, we're the most.
самое главное, господа, это у нас Fordow. Там, где находится,
Important
как
part of this
предполагается,
enriched
самая
uranium is located.
основная часть вот этого обогащенного урана.
which is closest to Iran to possess a nuclear bomb. What is known about this place, which is very
Иран
important,
к
and its
обладанию
data?
ядерной бомбой. Что известно об этом объекте, который очень важен? И вот его данные,
They are very important, specific data, because acquaintance with them immediately raises a lot of important questions.
тут же вызывают масса важных
Well,
вопросов.
I'll tell you what is known about the Ministry of Defense of the United States and the International Agency for Atomic Energy.
Атомная
The
энергия.
Fordow plant is located at a depth of 80 to 100 meters of rock mass. This is vertically.
Скального массива. Это по вертикали. Значит, такое расстояние.
But the main enriching block that includes the IR-1 centrifuge is located in the tunnels of the Jabal El Alam mountain range, with a
размещен в тоннелях, прорезанных горной грядой.
total level of protection, which is estimated from 180 to 300 meters of concrete and rock.
От 180 до 300 метров. Железобетон плюс скала.
That is, as far as I understand, it does not go deep, it can go sideways and so on, but taking into account that this block for
С
its
учетом, что вот этот блок для его укрепления
reinforcement was
являлся
changed as a natural rock, as well as iron and concrete. It is meant that its strength corresponds to a depth of up to 300 meters if it went down to the vertical of the rocky
до
rock.
300 метров, если бы это шло вниз вертикаль скалистой породы.
The early estimates of Iranian sources were in 2009-2011. They increased the depth for obvious reasons.
Увеличивали глубину. Понятно, по
They
понятным
claim that the
причинам.
depth is
Утверждали,
500
глубина
meters,
составляет
including the overhanging
500
rock,
метров.
plus the so-called
Включая
concrete dome and
надгробную
double steel doors.
породу, плюс бетонные так называемые купола и двойные стальные двери.
This may be misinformation, but in
Это,
reality, it is
дезинформация,
believed that the
но в
probable
реальности-
protective
в
equivalent of
реальности
this
считается,
block, this equipment
что
that
вероятный защитный эквивалент этого блока, этого оборудования, которое стоит,
stands
это
is 200 to 50 meters.
250
Well,
метров.
you remember, I called you the bomb that the Israelis initially considered necessary to destroy the reactors that are in this block.
Необходимо им иметь для уничтожения тех реакторов, которые находятся в этом
I was
блоке.
talking about a
Речь
unique
шла
bomb.
о
This is the most
бомбе
powerful
глобальной, самой
non-nuclear
мощной
bomb,
ядерной бомбы
GBU-57 MOB Massive
GBU-57
Ordnance
MOB,
Penetrator.
Massive Ordnance
The weight of the
Penetrator.
Boeing developer is 13.6 tons.
Вес, да, разработчик Boeing, вес 13,6
The
тонн.
maximum depth of penetration is
Максимальная
60
глубина
meters of
пробития
reinforced
или
concrete or
проникновения
30-40 meters of rock.
60 метров укрепленного бетона или 30-40 метров
And that's
скалы.
it, and the real depth is 200 to 50
А реальная
meters. This
глубина
is an equivalent calculation.
250 метров. Это эквивалентом
That
исчислением.
is, one bomb now becomes
То есть,
clear, in no way
одна
breaks
бомба
through, does not reach this
становится
block.
понятно, никоим образом не пробивает, не добивает до этого
Even if
блока.
you apply these bombs in a
Даже если
cascade
применять
version, that is,
эти
one
бомбы
after the other
каскадом
in one
варианте,
place,
то
2,
есть
3 in
одна
a
за
row,
другой в одно место, 2-3 подряд,
then it will not reach the level
то
of the
это не
Ford
достигнет
tunnels. That is,
уровня
deeper,
фордовских
100 meters,
туннелей,
even 3
фордовских
bombs in a
туннелей.
row in one place do not finish off.
То есть глубже в 100 метров даже 3 бомбы подряд в одно место не добивают. Таким образом,
Thus, the
GBU-57
GBU-57 and plus the B-2 bomber, this is the only bomber so far which has already been tested with the launch of this charge.
с несением этого заряда.
Does not solve this problem. Ford, in principle, does not strike from above, even with the use of the GBU-57, accompanied by the B-2 bombers. Here you are, as the grandmother and Yuri say, a day.
Вот вам, как говорится, бабушка и Юрьев день.
That is, for destruction, it is necessary either an explosion from the inside. The Israeli commandos have such an experience. I told you about it in Syria, but the depth there was much less, the fortifications were much weaker.
Слабее.
But they have, and then they needed to destroy an underground object. It took about 2 hours.
Где-то 2 часа.
Or the second option is to destroy the infrastructure, supply, ventilation, logistics in order to take the construction objects for months and years. That's how it is.
Вот таким образом. Ну и теперь
And now
мы
we come to the
переходим к
inevitable
выводу,
conclusion that,
что
well, at least Prime Minister Netanyahu knew that the Ford was rather a symbolic but unrealistic goal for the air bomb.
скорее символическая, а не реальная цель для авиабомбы. Естественно,
Naturally,
все его
all his
начальники,
military leaders,
начальники
close
действий
ministers,
об этом
all of
знали.
them knew about it. They
Они
came to
приезжали в
Washington
Вашингтон
during the
еще
Biden
при
administration,
администрации
and before Biden, they came to Trump's first cadenza. All with a request, give us a bomb and a bomber, because there is no way without them. But now we have to come to the conclusion that when they asked for all this, they understood that this type of weapon would not solve the problem. Why did they ask? They asked in order, it turns out, that the main goal was to involve the United States of America in this event. Then the leadership of Israel felt calm for various reasons. From a military point of view, to cover the sky above Israel before. Such a blow after such a blow from a diplomatic point of view and so on, and I have the impression that the Americans could not understand. I would read these estimates of the Ministry of Defense, that is, the Pentagon's assessment of the real depth of this Fordow reactor. The Americans also understood everything. And so there was such a campaign. Well, there were a lot of fools on a large scale. They had fierce arguments with each other on the public about, give me $1 million, give me a bomb, I won't give you a bomb, well, give me a bomb, well, no, it didn't work out with this, I went to someone else, and so on. In fact, it didn't make any sense. And behind the scenes at this time, Netanyahu masterfully, and what I'm telling you now, not what I'm thinking, the analysts here speak American, about what in the media is not particularly accepted to write. So Netanyahu, he very masterfully fooled Trump, which was, in fact, not difficult taking into account the level of knowledge in politics. Diplomacy, military affairs, which the 47th president has, as it is now called. That is, you know that an international treaty was signed with the participation of the Magadia, registered by the UN, the European Union was a separate participant in this treaty. According to this treaty, Iran was prohibited from enriching uranium to the level of weapons, but for peaceful purposes it had the right to carry out work and enrich uranium for peaceful purposes. On this matter, MAGATE carried out control in order to determine whether the world does not come or does not overcome this step that was allowed to him. Netanyahu and apparently the corresponding political forces and military circles suspected that Tehran was deceiving and probably had a reason for this. Although I do not remember that MAGATE declared that she would knock Iran on the fact that he was deceiving. I mean, during Obama, then the first condensation of Trump, then we have Biden. By and large, there were suspicions from the Israeli leadership, but there was no fixation of this violation from MAGATE. But Netanyahu managed to persuade Trump that this cannot be believed, they will still deceive. And therefore, in 1918, Trump came out of this agreement. Here it turned out that he was politically defeated in chess. Since then, there has been no such agreement before these events. Thus, it turns out that all these talks, when this war began, the first blows were made and it went like this. Here is Fordow, we need such a bomb. There are Israeli representatives running all over Washington. Every colleague from the US government is talking to each other. Give us a bomb, we can't do it without a bomb. It was all some kind of Amish, but Rubio, who wrote on behalf of the State Department, we have no relation to this. And Trump not knowing how it will end, and you remember about the one who always shudders at the end of the day. He decided to reassure himself, so he kept a complete and almost grave silence. This is 24 hours. And there followed powerful, successful, brilliant operations of the Israel Defense Force, Special Services, Mossad, where it became clear in any case that Trump is close to victory.
Победа близка, и это
And this is
блистательная
a
быстрая
brilliant,
победа.
quick
И Трамп
victory,
так и
and
говорит,
Trump
Москва
apparently did not
проснулась,
sleep at night and
что
woke
ж
up and
я?
said, well, it's me,
Это
it's
же
Slava.
слава идет, слава в руки
Slava is begging
просится.
in his
И вот он
arms,
разражает
and
все
so
свои
he is
соцсети
irritated by his
ночными
social
буквами
networks with big letters that I
о
have
том,
achieved
что
victory. That
я
is, I have
добился
settled, I have
победы, так
stopped the
сказать,
war between Serbia and
прекратил
Kosovo
войну
once.
между Сербией и Косово там когда-то.
I stopped the war
Я
between
прекратил
India and
войну между
Pakistan
Индией
now.
и
I will settle
Пакистаном
this
сейчас.
conflict too. That is, he
Я
said that I would do
урегулирую
it.
и этот конфликт. То есть он сказал, что я его сделаю. То есть
He felt that the
почувствовал
ship of
себя
victory is not for
гордцом
him, but
победы.
somewhere is
Ему,
blowing. He
вернее,
decided
не
to
ему,
tune in
а
there.
куда-то там
And he
в
said
бункере
in
решил
almost
туда
open
пристроиться.
text that, in
И он
fact,
чуть ли
he
не
was
открытым
aware of the
текстом сказал,
matter, he
что,
almost
собственно говоря,
gave
он в
light,
курсе
he was
дела, он
almost the
чуть ли не дал
commander.
свет, он чуть ли не командующий.
If you
Если
read this
почитать
post, it turns out that he
очень,
almost
он
thought
чуть ли
up
не
this whole
замыслил
operation.
всю эту операцию.
And so,
И
apparently it was 2 days, and on the
видимо,
3rd,
значит,
or
это было
no,
двое
Friday,
суток,
but
а
somewhere
на
from the second
третий
half of Saturday,
значит,
unpleasant things
пятницу, а
began
вот
to happen.
где-то со второй половины дня в субботу начали происходить неприятные вещи.
The Americans
Американцы
knew, I
знали, я
told
вам
you
как
about it.
рассказывал,
General
что Ким в
Keane,
самом
at the very
начале
beginning of the war, the
войны,
first
первого
strike of
удара
Israel,
Израиля,
reported that
сообщил о
Iran
том,
has
что
about 2,000
у
ballistic
Ирана имеется
missiles, the
около
most
2000 баллистических ракет. Самое грозное оружие, которое
powerful weapon that
сегодня
flies there only a
в
few
отличие от
minutes,
дронов,
unlike the
которые летают,
drones that fly, I
по-моему,
think, a
там
few
сколько,
hours, 1,500
600,
kilometers.
1500 километров.
Yes, so they counted
Да,
2,000 and assumed
так вот,
that in
насчитывали
response to the
2000
Israeli strikes, the Iranians would
и
make a massive hit
предполагали,
with these
что
missiles in
в ответ на израильские удары иранцы нанесут массовый удар
order to
против
try to
ракеты
break
для
through
того,
this
чтобы
Iron
попытаться
Dome,
прорвать
and there is
вот эту
still a
железную
row,
стену.
and there
Помните,
is
там
still
Перл
David's
и там еще
brooch.
проща Давида.
But the Iranians did it
А,
differently. They
Но
began to
иранцы
launch
поступили
100
иначе.
rockets a day,
Они
and this
начали
was due to
запускать
the
по
weakness
100
that the
ракет в
launchers were
день.
badly
И это
damaged.
было
They were
сочтено
damaged.
Моссадом, потому
Mossad
что
worked
сильно
with this.
повреждены пусковые установки. Они были повреждены, там Моссад с этим
Remember
работал.
this
Это
operation
израильские
with
дроны,
drones, which,
которые, ну,
well,
как
as
калька
Kalka reminded the
выполняла
operation
операцию
of Ukraine with drones on the
Украины с
territory of
дронами
Russia.
на территории России.
And they thought
И,
that's it,
видимо,
the end of
все,
Iran, and apparently Trump
конец
sensed that the
Ирану.
victory
И,
was
видимо,
close, and he was
значит,
disgusted by this
Трамп
post.
почуял это, что победа близка, и вот разразился этим постом.
But
А
on
вот в субботу,
Saturday, there
в субботу
began to
начали
be trouble.
происходить
It turned
неприятности.
out that it was the
Оказалось,
tactics of the
что
Iranians.
это была тактика иранцев. Они
At
сначала
first, they
начали
began to
запускать
launch,
старые
apparently, old rockets,
большие
small
боеголовки.
warheads.
Они
They figured out
выяснили,
where the
где находятся
anti-missile air defense and air defense
установки противоракетной ПВО и ПРО Израиля.
systems of Israel are located.
А потом начали
Then they
увеличивать
began to
количество
increase the number
ракет,
of
и вот
rockets.
где-то
And then,
20
somewhere in the
дня
second half of the
субботы,
day,
если не
on
ошибаюсь,
Saturday, if I'm not
80
mistaken, I can be
летательных
mistaken,
злом,
I don't have
50
enough
океанов,
words
я
because
сейчас
I'm still
скажу,
watching it all over the
примерно.
ocean. The
Количество
amount
начало
began to
увеличиваться,
increase, the gap of this
прорыв
Iron
этого
Dome began to
купола
expand, and as a
железного
result, it turned
стал
out that, at least for
расширяться,
yesterday,
и в результате получилось, что, ну, по крайней мере, на вчерашний день
it
оказалось,
turned
что
out that
примерно
about
10%,
10%, at
ну, как
least
минимум
10% of
10%
Iranian
иранских
missiles
ракет,
penetrated
пролетая
through
через
this
этот
dome
купол
and
и
hit
поражает
objects on the
по двери
territory of
территории
Israel.
Израиля. И
And then the
тут-то
main
вот
rockets
пошли
entered. The
основные
main rockets are
ракеты.
called Shad Koch
Основные
Qassam.
ракеты, которые называются Шахет, Хач, Кассам, по-моему.
This is
Это
a
новые
new
ракеты,
rocket
которые
that entered
способны
our
поражать
arms in the
20-х годов.
1920s. Its
Дальность
range is
1200
1,200 km, but they are said to be almost
километров, дальность
1,500
чуть ли не
km.
1500.
And they launched a fairly
И
high-speed,
достаточно
long-range
скоростная
rocket,
дальнобойная
and they began to
ракета.
cause a very big nuisance to the
И вот
civilian
их начали
object on the
запустить.
entire
И они
territory
начали
of
быть
Israel,
очень
by and
большой
large.
объектом гражданским на всей территории Израиля, по большому счету.
And even in Tel
Даже
Aviv
в
itself,
самом
several
Тель-Авиве,
strikes were
во время
made,
нанесения
since the
второго удара,
Israelis did not immediately
вот,
report
насколько
there were
израильтяне
such
сразу не
messages.
сообщали, было такие сообщения.
Several rockets were
Несколько
fixed,
ракет было
these Shad
зафиксировано, вот
Hatch,
этих
which fell there or were
Шахет,
hit there, where the
Хач,
Ministry of
которые
Defense of
упали
Israel is
там или
located.
ударили там, где находится Министерство обороны Израиля.
But hit or
Но
not, the
поражены
Ministry of
нет
Defense is
Министерства
not
обороны,
clear, but
понятно,
they...
а вот гражданские объекты вокруг него поражены. Ну, я вот буквально за час до начала записи я
Civilian
уточнил,
facilities around it were
источникам
hit.
пишут,
Well,
что
just an hour before
было
the beginning of the
поражено
recording, I
Министерство
clarified about the
обороны
existing.
Израиля.
Or
И
says
вообще
they write that the
количество
Ministry of Defense of
жертв
Israel was hit.
и разрушений,
And in
которые
general, the
сейчас
number of
нанесли
victims and destructions
иранские
that Iraq's
и
missiles
иракские
have
ракеты,
inflicted
оно
now
может
can
быть
only be
сравнимо
compared
только
to
с
1991, when
1991
in
годом, когда в
response to the
ответ
Operation
на
War in the Gulf,
операцию
remember, Saddam
«Война в
Hussein,
заливе»,
Turksev,
помните,
Kuwait,
Саддам Хусейн
Americans hit
против
back
Кувейта,
Iraq began
американцы
to
в
launch
ответ
SCAT.
нанесли ответный удар, и иракцы в ответ начали запускать ракеты
Missiles of
«Скат»
Soviet
советского
production in the
производства еще
mid-50s
в
on the
середине 50-х
territory
годов.
of Israel. At that time, the Israelis did not have an expanded
Израиля
anti-missile defense system.
развернутой
There were
мощной системы
serious
противоракетной
destructions.
обороны, были разрушения, серьезные разрушения. Так вот,
So on Saturday
в
and
субботу,
Sunday,
воскресенье
Israel was
по
hit
Израилю
harder,
был
and there were
нанесен
more
более
destructions and more
сильный
deaths than
удар,
in
были
1991.
нанесены больше разрушений, оказалось больше погибших, чем в 1991
This
году.
is the situation,
Вот
but
такая
Trump had
сложилась
already
ситуация.
announced that he would have to
Но
sleep
Трамп
for a few
уже
more hours, he would
заявил,
have been reported.
ему бы доспать до конца еще бы несколько часов, ему бы доложили, но
But
он
the
не хотел
intelligence report does
доклад
not listen
разведки
regularly.
слушать
Apparently,
нерегулярно,
Fox
видимо,
News did not
Fox
notify
News не
him.
сообщил ему.
In
Короче говоря,
short,
он
he
уже
said that
сказал,
everything
что
would be
он
fine, and he had already
все
given
уладит,
instructions to launch
и дал
these,
уже
to send these
указания
aircraft to the
к
refuelers.
запуску вот этих, к отправке этих самолетов заправщиков.
Thus, a situation arose
Таким
that with the
образом,
strength of
сложилась
Israel's
ситуация,
defense, taking into account the
что
experience
силам
of the
обороны
last 2
Израиля,
days,
с
it is
учетом
necessary to reset the
полученного
priorities
опыта
of
за последние 2
anti-aircraft
дня,
and anti.
необходимо перенастроить приоритеты противоракетной и противовоздушной
Defense,
обороны.
as I have already
Как я
said,
уже
there are
сказал,
3
3
types of
типа
defense
системы
systems, and in
защиты.
3 of them you need to
Нужно
strengthen,
в
I'm
них 3
sorry,
нужно
David and
усилить
Errol.
прощу Давида и Эрл, которые
Which are targeted at intercepting medium and large-range missiles. At the strategic level, having understood or seen the vulnerability of the core of the defense infrastructure, that is, the PRO system,
ядра оборонной инфраструктуры, то есть системы
Israel
ПРО,
had to reconsider its tactics in
Израиль
general
должен был
in conducting
пересмотреть
these military
вообще
actions.
свою тактику ведения этих боевых действий. Если
If at
сначала,
first,
видимо,
apparently, the army of Israel
армия
considered a
Израиля
slow escalation
рассматривала
towards the arguments for the
медленную
expansion of the
эскалацию
U.S. military zone in
в сторону аргументов за расширение военного
the
зонта
region,
США
that
над
is,
Ливаном.
simply speaking, it turned
То
out
есть,
that there
просто
is a
говоря,
hole, it is very
казалось, что
dangerous,
есть
it
дыра,
takes time to patch it up,
она
there
очень
is no
опасна,
time there.
нужно время для того, чтобы его залатать, времени нет. Терпеть
Are
такое
no
количество
opportunities to endure such
тоже
a number
нет
of victims,
возможности,
therefore,
поэтому
as for the
подходит
air probe
необходим
of the United
воздушный
States in the
зонд.
region is needed,
Соединенные
and
Штаты
here,
и
the
регион.
aircraft and
И вот
refuelers
здесь
of the
и
United
поднялись вверх самолеты-заправщики
States
и
of America
самолеты
have risen.
Америки.
What to do now
Что
with
делать теперь
Netanyahu in
Нетаньяху?
this situation?
В
That
этой
is, having
ситуации, то
analyzed the
есть
situation, the analysts
анализируя
believe
имеющую
that it is
ситуацию,
necessary to move
аналитики
to the
считают,
boom.
что нужно переходить бум, то есть
That
молниеносная
is,
война
a
уже не
lightning-fast
получается.
war is no longer
Во-первых,
possible.
уязвимость
First,
системы
the
ПРО,
vulnerability of
во-вторых,
the RO system. Secondly,
не
the system of
уничтожена
production and enrichment of this
система
uranium is
производства
not
обогащения
destroyed.
этого урана.
Fordow turns
Fordow,
out to be
оказывается,
practically
вообще
impossible at
практически
all.
чуть ли
It is
было
necessary to
невозможно
physically
его
destroy it,
физически
and there it is
уничтожать, а
necessary to
туда
go
надо
there. This is an
дойти туда,
underground
это
operation.
наземная операция, то есть
That is the
сложнейшее
most
дело.
difficult
Что
thing. What
необходимо?
is needed?
Видимо,
A
стратегическая
strategic
пауза,
pause is
плюс
necessary, plus
усилить
to
ИГИЛ
strengthen the
и
cyber and
бомбовую
drone
кампанию.
companies. They will
Попытаться
try to
все это
destroy all
уничтожить
this with the help of
с
cyber
помощью
weapons, with the
кибероружия,
help
при
of
помощи
drones.
дронов. Тут варианты
There are different options here,
разные
and the
есть.
most likely option is to
И
switch to the
наиболее
phase of intellectual
вероятным
expelling the enemy.
представляется вариант перехода в фазу интеллектуального изматывания противника,
It is the
нанесения
application
точечных
of
дроновых
point-blank drone
ударов,
strikes, cyber
кибератак,
attacks, the elimination of
ликвидация
scientists, and the
заключенных и
personnel who
персонала,
work in the
который там работает,
corresponding military.
соответствующих военных.
The advantages
Плюс
are that
это
this reduces the risk of a total
снижает
war when everyone is being
всеобщей
tortured
войны,
and
когда
so
мочат
on.
все
This
всем и
reduces
так
the
далее.
risk of an
Ничем не
unlimited war.
ограниченной войны. Это снижает риск.
The Israelis
Сохраняется
keep the initiative and the employees are
инициатива.
involved,
Ну
the
и добивается
allies, because without the allies there is no
союзников
solution to this issue.
нет решения этого вопроса. Минусы.
Minuses, the problem of
Не
Fordow is
решается
not solved
проблема Fordow
directly, it still
напрямую. Она
remains,
по-прежнему
and the
остается.
danger of it is the
Опасность
same
его
as I
то же
told you at
самое,
the
что
very
он говорил в
beginning,
самом
now they
начале,
write
сейчас
about
об
it.
этом пишут.
The
Что
worst option of the
худший вариант
unresolved
нерешенной
problem of
проблемы
Fordow
Fordow
is, well, first
это,
of
ну,
all,
во-первых,
the Iranians, I mean
иранцы,
representatives of power, give the
я имею в виду
opportunity to
представители
scream
власти,
in
дают
their
возможность
propaganda.
кричать в своей пропаганде.
We stood up, we
Мы
were not
выстояли,
destroyed, we are the
нас не
heroes of the
уничтожили, мы
victors.
герои
This is how
победители.
Damhas Hussein liked to scream when he
Вот как
lost the
это
campaign
любил
until
кричать
he
Саддам
was hanged.
Хусейн, когда проигрывал кампанию, пока его в конце концов не повесили.
On the other
С
hand, there
другой
is a
стороны,
danger that
тут
Iran can restore this program.
возникает опасность о том, что Иран может восстановить эту программу. То есть
The most
самое
prognosis
такое
about the possibility of restoration, which I have
прогноз о
heard so
возможности
far, is
восстановления, который я
blurred.
до сих пор
For
слышал,
2
это
weeks, the
на самом деле
restoration of the
от
power
недели
plant,
двух
well, maybe up to a
восстановления
month,
электростанции,
a
ну, может
year,
быть, до
maybe a
месяца,
year, and so on.
может быть, год там и так далее.
But
Но
this
это
is
не
not a
радикальное
radical
решение.
solution. That is, until now, due to the non-resolution of the question with Ford, the risk of liquidation.
Ликвидация опасности применения
Use, or rather use or get the necessary uranium and the creation of an atomic bomb, it has not decreased much compared to where it was a month ago, let's say.
по сравнению с тем, где она находилась месяц назад, допустим.
Yes, there were liquidating people who were engaged in this, but apparently there is a second or third echelon that can use this matter.
Второй, третий эшелон, которые могут этим делом, это дело воспользоваться.
As a result, a strategic swank hit Netanyahu, so any move leads to a risk.
ведет к риску.
On the other hand, it is necessary to act further, not to stop, because the refusal of further steps guarantees strategic loss.
Это гарантирует стратегический проигрыш.
Therefore, it turns out that the most likely future scenario is a hybrid pause, plus pressure on the allies, first of all the United States, then the United States, the United Kingdom.
Эмираты, Великобритания.
Preparation for the next blow, but already with the help of an ally.
С помощью союзников.
And the allies again, how will they solve this with the existing?
С имеющейся бомбой, не знаю. Но для начала нужно, наверное, ставить под контроль физически наземные
I do not know, but first you probably need to put under control the physical ground operations of this fort and then decide what to do with it. Well, in this situation, Trump, or rather not Trump, but the Ministry of Defense, of course, took all the sanctions and launched all these refueling planes. As a result, what is the position of the United States after all this? That is, officially, the United States still does not participate in.
Но как бы message. Все открыто. Все варианты на столе.
The strikes, but everything is open, all options are on the table. The United States is ready to intervene. This is just a sharp turn in comparison with the original position declared by the State Department by the mouth of Rubio.
Устами Рубио.
That is, Trump has crossed a thin line. He does not exclude direct support of Israel, including not only the protection of Israel and its airspace and territory, but also joint offensive operations.
Но и совместных наступательных операций.
And here I will say it in a big way, gentlemen, I don't know if he understood it from the very beginning or not, but he put his presidency on the map.
Свое президентство.
Because, God forbids, let me tell you a simple version. American trade ships do not sail in the Armenian Strait, but there, in that area, there are a lot of American warships and additional ships are in a hurry to help.
И еще дополнительные спешат на помощь.
Here is a blow to this Shad Koch Qasim on a large ship of
Под
the
этим Шахед Хач Касам по крупному кораблю Соединенных Штатов, не дай бог, по авианосцу. И вы представляете, что тогда будет? То есть открытое
United
вмешательство
States,
Соединенных
God
Штатов
forbid, on an
в
aircraft
операцию
carrier,
вот
and you can
оно
imagine what will
и
happen
грозит.
then.
Больше, чем 2-3 дня назад. Вот сейчас-то и возникла угроза вот этой
Therefore, the
большой
infrastructure is
крупномасштабной
ready. Israel
войны.
is holding back with the help of
Поэтому
America the freedom
инфраструктура
of hand.
готова. Сдерживание Израилю дает вот это при помощи Америки. Свободный
Although, on
рух.
the other hand, the United States
Хотя,
is
с
at
другой стороны,
risk of
рискует
entering a new
втянуть
war.
США в новую
And if
войну.
Iranian strikes hit
Если
American
иранские
objects,
удары
then the United
попадут
States, in the
по
current
американским
situation,
объектам,
automatically
то
enters this
США
war,
в нынешней
gentlemen.
ситуации вступают в эту войну автоматически,
And
господа.
there is a largest
А
base
там
in the
есть
Middle
на
East,
Ближнем
in Saudi
Востоке
Arabia. That
крупнейшая
is, there are
база
many options.
в Саудовской Аравии. То есть вариантов много.
The
И
result
результат
is an armed signal
это
to America. This is not an order forward, but an armed signal that
Америке.
we are
Это еще
ready.
не приказ вперед, но вооруженный сигнал, что мы готовы.
And if, I repeat,
И если
Israel
Израиль
continues to strike
продолжит
and the
ударить на
Iranians strike
Ливан,
back on the
саботирует,
American goal,
угрожает
everything will
американскую
quickly
цель,
turn into a
все
regional
быстро
war with
превратится
global
в региональную
consequences.
войну с глобальными последствиями.
And then quickly arises the question
И
of
тут
the need to
быстренько
regulate.
возникает
And today,
вопрос о
especially, there were a lot
необходимости
of messages about the
урегулирования.
fact
И сегодня особенно поступила масса сообщений по поводу того, что
that the Iranian authorities are
власти
negotiating with Russian
Ирана ведут
representatives and with
переговоры
other
с
states through
российскими
third countries.
представителями и с другими государствами через там третьи
A
страны.
significant part of this information
Значительная
is
часть этой
questionable because a
информации
significant part of it came
представляется
from a source
сомнительной,
called
поскольку
Iran Wire.
значительная часть ее
Iran
поступила
Wire
из
is not the
источника,
source that we
называется
should trust on this
Iran
issue.
Wire. То есть это не тот источник, которому стоит доверять по этому вопросу.
But
Но
there are several
помните,
serious
что
sources that allow us to
серьезные
understand. Well, first
источники,
of all,
которые
Trump is
позволяют
successful, although
понять.
Iran, let's start
Ну,
with
во-первых,
Iran first.
Трамп успешно, хотя Иран, давайте начнем сначала с Ирана.
Iran, apparently this is reliable
Иран,
information,
судя по
through its
всему, это
allies, the Emirates, through
достоверная
Qatar,
информация, через своих союзников, Эмираты, через Катар,
is trying to get into negotiations with the
пытается
United
тянуть,
States of
выйти
America
на
and
переговоры
even with
напрямую с
Israel.
Соединенными Штатами
Iran
Америки.
is ready, its
Иран что
opposition,
же?
what are they ready for?
Иран готов, вот его позиция, на что они готовы? Они
They are
готовы
ready to
подписать
sign a
договор о
treaty
том,
that
что
they
они не
will not
будут
develop their own
разрабатывать
uranium
свой
to the
уран
degree, to the
до
readiness to make an atomic bomb,
степени, до
and they will
готовности
not
для
make it. But
изготовления
this, in
атомной
fact,
бомбы
is
и не
nothing
будут
new.
ее изготавливать. Но это, собственно говоря, ничего нового. Это та
This is
позиция,
the
которая
opposition that
существовала с
existed since
2015
2015
года,
when this
когда был
treaty with Iran was
подписан этот
signed.
договор с
At
Ираном.
that time, they
Тогда
were
они
obliged not
обязались
to develop
не
uranium to the
разрабатывать
level of
уран
weapons
до
and not to
оружейного
carry out an
степени и не
atomic
совершать
bomb.
атомную бомбу.
Then
Потом
Ayatollah took them to
аятоллаты
fatwa,
ихние
which declared that
привели
uranium
фатву,
was an
заявил, что
ill-fated
уран
weapon, an atomic
это
bomb.
не
Therefore,
богоугодное,
Iran
негодное
does not
Аллаху
produce
оружие,
it.
атомная
That
бомба,
is,
поэтому Иран
Iran has not
демонстративно
made any
подписал.
decisive concessions so
Никаких там
far.
сногсшибательных уступок пока.
It said that it was
Что
ready
готов
to sign
подписать
what
то,
it had
что
signed in
в 2015
2015.
году.
It wants to enter the
Хочет
United
вступить в
States.
Соединенные Штаты.
Donnie, who was
Дон,
shouting big
который
letters to himself, I will
кричал
establish a
большими
peace
буквами,
there,
короче
I
говоря,
will
я
settle
установлю,
everything.
значит,
The
мир
threat,
там,
that
я
is,
все
his star-like
улажу.
hour, as if it were coming, right?
Грозно, это его звездный час как будто наступил, правильно, да?
And now it turns out that
Вроде
he
как
is
как-то
pushing
везде
everywhere, as if he is
как
Putin
будто
himself,
у
a
этого
pale
самого
mule.
Путина,
In
эмблема
general,
Путина.
he acts as if he is a
Действует так, как будто
lobbyist
он
of
является
Putin.
лоббистом Путина.
He begins to
Он
tell that
начинает
it is
рассказывать, что
necessary
надо
to
Путина
attract
привлекать
Putin
к
to this
этому
matter
делу до
to the
такой
extent
степени,
that
что
Macron has already rebelled.
Макрон восстал. Не,
First,
сначала
it was Nikki
это
Haley
Никки
who
Хейли
said, "Who are
сказала,
you attracting?
вы кого
This is an
привлекаете? Это
aggressor,
же
this is a
агрессор, это
military
военный
criminal, this is a
преступник,
person
это
who is in
человек,
charge
который
of the
руководит
country,
страной,
who since
которая с
1922 has
22 года
overshadowed the entire
перечеркнула
international law
все
of the
международное право, устав ООН. Как его
UN.
можно
How can
вообще
he be
допускать
allowed to have
какие-то
any
переговоры?
negotiations at
На
all?
основании
On what
чего
basis can you use the country as an
можно
intermediary which
использовать
has
страну в
trampled
качестве
on
посредника,
international
который
law with its own
расторгает
actions
международное
and
право своими
continues to do
собственными
this every
действиями и
day?
продолжает это делать каждый день? Это
Don't
безумие.
worry, Macron has now
Макрон теперь
spoken.
выступил.
Today, Donnie comes
Нет,
to
сегодня Тони
G7, to
приезжает
Alberta,
на
to
G7 в
Canada.
Альберту, в Канаду.
One of his
Одно из
first
первых
statements
его
on the fact
высказываний
that
по поводу
Putin
того,
spoke
что
only to me because he was offended by
будете
all the
разговаривать
other
только со мной,
G7
потому что он
leaders, but they
обиделся на всех
offended
других
him.
лидеров
This is
G7.
some kind of crazy house. This
Это
is some
какой-то
kind of
сумасшедший
sixth
дом,
chamber.
шестая
Sometimes I
палата.
listen to
Я
it.
его
I read it
слушаю,
all.
читаю.
I have the
Мне кажется,
impression
что
that I am
я
beginning to
начинаю
lose my
терять
mind in this crazy world.
рассудок в этом сумасшедшем мире. То есть даже
Even
после
after
того, как
Putin
он
uptaped Putin so many
Путин
times
столько раз
about the
фейсабиловал
24-hour
Украину,
regulation
говорил
of the
по поводу
situation in Ukraine,
24
he is
часов
now
по
dragging
урегулированию
it into the
ситуации в Украине,
regulation
он
of the
теперь его
matter.
тянет в урегулирование вопроса,
These are deals as a black
который
intermediary in a
сделки,
deal that can be the
как
most
черного
important, the most
посредника,
dangerous
сделки,
deal of the
которая может быть
21st
самой
century.
главной, самой опасной сделкой 21 века.
A
Сделка
deal in the
на
Middle
Ближнем
East
Востоке
between
между
Iran and
Ираном
Israel
и
and other
Израилем, еще
countries.
там рядом
This
посреди
is some
государства.
kind of
Скажем так.
nightmare. On the one
Но с другой
hand,
стороны,
it is
считается,
believed
что
that it is not just
это
like
не просто
that.
так.
This is
Это
not behind Putin's
не
back, not behind his eyes.
запрешь за
Cheap
Путин
logic
стоит
is
за
being
его
used
глаза.
here.
Тут гешефтная логика просматривается.
That
С другой
is,
стороны,
Trump, despite any
жестко,
criticism, he
несмотря на
continues to
любую
act as an
критику, он
active, effective
продолжает
lobbyist of
выступать
Putin,
активным, эффективным лоббистом Путина,
trying
пытаясь
to drag him
втащить
back
его
into the system of civilized states.
обратно в
Iran
систему
acts through
цивилизованных
Qatar,
государств.
Oman of Saudi Arabia,
Иран
but under
действует
one
через Катар,
condition.
Оман, Саудовскую Аравию. Но при одном условии.
Iran still sets the
Иран должен
conditions.
ставить условия.
Israel must stop
Израиль
hitting,
должен
and the United
прекратить
States must
нанесение
refuse to
ударов.
participate in providing
Соединенные
aid
Штаты
and
должны
the general
отказаться
assessment
от
of the
участия
situation.
в оказании помощи, ну и общая оценка ситуации.
That
Без
is, without a
временного
temporary
прекращения огня
ceasefire,
и,
and
возможно,
perhaps
без
guarantees from the
гарантий от
United
Соединенных
States in the
Штатов
near future, an
в
open
ближайшее
dialogue
время
between Iran and the United
открытый
States.
диалог Ирана с Соединенными Штатами,
Israel,
Израиль,
most
скорее всего,
likely, as
как
analysts
считают
think, will not start.
аналитики,
This gives Washington and
союз, скорее
Jerusalem
всего,
a
не
diplomatic
начнется.
lever.
Это дает Вашингтону и Иерусалиму дипломатический рычаг.
If Israel agrees to
Если
pause,
Израиль
discussion is
согласится
possible.
на
If not, the
паузу,
war continues.
возможно обсуждение. Если нет, война продолжается.
Well, I think that the
Ну
main
и я
lever
думаю,
from
что
which the further
все-таки
development of events depends
главным рычагом, от которого зависит дальнейшее развитие событий,
is the question of the
это вопрос
presence
о
or absence of
наличии
the
или
presence of these
отсутствии
rockets, Shahd, Hajj, Qasim,
наличия
Iranian.
вот этих ракет Шахед, Хадж, Касым, иранских.
Of these, it was considered that there were about 2,000. How many of them were among them, it was not clear. clear, but 2000 it was for some time before the beginning of this war. Then it was established that every month Iran has the opportunity to produce 300 new ones. It is unknown how many there are now. It is known that it was planned to produce 20,000 by 2030. In general, something like that, 2,000, something like that, maybe 3,000. On the other hand, the Israel Defense Forces report that they destroyed about one-third of the launchers. Launchers are one thing or a rocket together. Launchers together with rockets, this is different. That is, a lot is not clear here. In short, the situation is such. There is a danger that if, as quickly as possible, the Americans do not interfere and do not close the sky, then the hole in this dome over Israel can expand and these latest Iranian missiles will fall there, causing an unacceptable damage that the Israelis have not been accustomed to since 1991. That is, at least 2 generations of Israelis have not seen or experienced anything like this. The Ukrainians are used to this. Now the Israelis understand why the Ukrainians are used to it. But Ukrainians are much more used to it because Ukrainians experience this every day practically. The situation depends very much on this and, of course, on the question about the Fordow. That is, this is the path to the decisive and brilliant victory of Israel. Or, as I wrote in the headlines of one of the previous videos, this is the door to hell. My position here, that is, here the viewers love to write, some ask why they love Israel, others say what I hate Iran for. I have one criterion here, you see, I act here as an objective analyst. I only have one tendency which may somehow draw attention a little, not objectivity, but the direction of my thoughts. This is called the system of logical priorities. That is, the main priority for me in relation to one or another situation is how it all will affect Ukraine. From here it is absolutely simple. Iran is a country, this is a regime which produces a murder weapon which every day destroys. Civilians live on the territory of Ukraine, destroys people, kills people. Women, children, old people, this is done by the Iranian regime. Moreover, Ukraine has not done anything to them at all, and Ukraine has never had any political or ideological disagreements with Iran. Iran does this by, I would say, the animalistic nature of the regime. This is how I treat it. Otherwise, for me, this is inexplicable. In order to show their allied relations with Russia, Iran supplies Russia with a weapon of murder of people that Iran has. Never had any relation with and does not have any relation with. This is inhumane, this is illogical. What kind of regime is it? It has no human right to exist. This is a regime that does not correspond to any religion at all, to any moral basis. Therefore, the ally of Ukraine is not my ally, but the enemy of Ukraine. This is my enemy. This is how I relate to this, gentlemen. Therefore, on the basis of everything complex, as usual, the glory of Ukraine and its armed forces, the enemy will be defeated, the victory will be ours. To you, dear friends, endurance, courage, firm faith, you are our inevitable victory. See you soon.